Hello and welcome to Building Your Best Brain podcast. My name is Sylvie. I'm a fourth year PhD student in neuroscience as well as a yoga and meditation teacher. And today's episode is probably going to be my geekiest episode yet. And there's a few reasons for this. So if you follow me on Instagram at synaptic.sylvie, I did a poll and I asked what you guys want to learn from me next, whether we wanted to dive into meditation in the brain, look at breath work in the brain and stress regulation, or look at neurofeedback, and that's using your own brain's electrical recordings to guide and learn in a different way. And then, for one, it was an absolute even split between all three. And then it got me thinking that, all of these are pretty meaty, juicy, heavy topics. And a big part in truly appreciating and being able to integrate all that great information and research that all those topics have is to have a good fundamental understanding of neuroscience. Over the years, there have been people that have DM'd me on Instagram asking for good neuroscience resources to learn the basics about the brain, and I have shared them, and they certainly exist, but beyond the academic setting, there aren't a ton of places where you get kind of basic fundamental neuroscience understanding. I will link some into the show notes, but we get a lot of information, right? We're in the era of information. You get lots of snippets and reels of really great research. Some of it, overhyped and some of it not, but it's hard to convey complex ideas in a minute and a half. It's hard, and truly, it's impossible, right? And why should complex things be fully appreciated and understood in a minute, right? There's a reason why research takes years and years and years and huge teams and lots of people and people to review it, right? It is a rigorous process for a reason. So with that being said, this episode is all about fundamental parts that make our brain. I talk a lot about rewiring, and it's something I'm super passionate about. And I was a neuroscientist first, and then through my own healing journey, did I start to click together the fundamental neuroscience concepts with the actual practical tools to be able to shift your brain in a different way. So for this episode, I'm going to get into some of those fundamentals, and I will link it to real life. So I promise it won't be your typical boring, you're going to get a test after this kind of episode, but it will be a lot of information. So I'm going to try and I have a video version of this. So if you're listening to this in your ears, know that I am going to probably throw some diagrams up, and I will do my best to be as descriptive as possible. So you don't need to see the video, but of course the video will be there for you. And I'm going to timestamp all this because, you're going to absorb, knowing you're likely an extremely curious person, and, you don't like being told what to implement or what to believe without some proof, some evidence, some more explanation. But our brain needs a lot of stimulation for things to truly sink in. So I'm going to timestamp the episode into different parts. So if at any point you're consuming information and you're like, oh, would this be something good for my client or my coaching student? Or, oh, is this something that I want to try and implement? Oh, but what was it about brainwave activity again? You can come here and get a refresher and listen to it over and over again. This, I hope, can serve as a really great resource for you for your brain fundamentals as you go out into the world and figure out, what tools are for you and what are not for you. So you get the most out of your time, out of your brain, all that juicy stuff. So without further ado, let's get started. When we're talking about rewiring your brain or training your brain, we're talking about circuits in your brain. And now, these circuits are made up of many different types of cells in your brain. When I tell people this, sometimes it blows their mind. There's many different cell types in your brain, but the ones that we're going to focus on and that are, for argument's sake, the biggest players are neuron. So your brain is made up of billions of neurons, many different types, many different shapes, and these are used to build circuits. Now, neurons have an extremely unique shape. Most cells in the body are symmetrical, so usually when you think of a cell, you think of a blob that is a circle, and one side looks the same as the other. And neurons are special because they're polarized. And all that means is that one end of a neuron looks super different than the other end of the neuron. And there's a very important functional reason for this. So one end of the neuron is full of these branches, and it really looks like branches on a tree. And we call these dendrites. And what dendrites do is that they sense the environment of that neuron and basically receive signals from other neurons. What those signals are, we'll get into very, very soon. And so it receives all these signals, and then it gets traveled along a long, skinny portion of the neuron, which is called an axon. And so an axon, similar to a tree, I guess this is the analogy we're using today, would be the trunk of the tree. Now, this trunk of the tree has other cells wrapped around it called myelin. And myelin, there are these really fatty cells, and what they do is they help insulate the axon so that the signal can propagate, which just means travel down to the base in an efficient way. So it would be similar to the bark on a tree. Another analogy I like to use is it's like a wire, right? A copper wire. The white rubber would be the myelin in this case, helping that signal not get lost as it makes its way down. Then as the signal makes its way down, there's a few other branches, but fewer. And this, I would say, are kind of similar to like the roots of a tree. And these are called axon terminals, or terminal buttons, or boutons, if you're French, or not French. And these house our neurotransmitters. So these, I'm sure you've heard, it's a very popular word, and there's lots of popular neurotransmitters that buzz around the internet. Dopamine is a top hit. Serotonin has got to come to a close second. So these axon terminals will house these vesicles, which are just like fatty packages of neurotransmitters. And so now we're going to get into how does a neuron communicate with another, right? So which they are, neurons are building blocks to a circuit. How do they talk to each other? It happens in this space called the synapse. So the synapse is a very, very small space between the terminal button of one neuron that has a small space with a dendrite of another neuron. When the signal travels, so let's say neuron 1 receives a lot of signals from other neurons, it then has an electrical pulse that goes all the way down the axon. Once it reaches the bottom at the axon terminal, or terminal bouton, they're interchangeable, neurotransmitters get released in this small space. The dendrite of neuron 2 has a bunch of proteins called receptors. And what they do is they allow certain neurotransmitters to bind. And through this binding, they basically get a signal. And they start accumulating these signals into the other neuron, which will either make it fire, right? So continuing the signal, or not fire. And this decision depends on so many different variables. Neurotransmitters do not have one type of receptors. Dopamine, for example, has at least 5 types of receptors. And so this small space where the communication happens is called the synapse. And so 2 neurons that connect together don't actually physically touch. They signal through this extremely small space. And so when you have a collection of neurons that are connected through synaptic connections, this is what we call a circuit. And so a very simple definition of a circuit is a collection of neurons that connect together to perform a specific function. And so usually you have a kind of sensory neuron, right, that's taking information in. You will then have an output neuron, which actually does the whatever function that is. And then you have neurons in between that connect the two, which we call interneurons. So a very simple example would be, you want to kick a soccer ball. So you have the sensory information of being able to look for where the ball is. You then have the motor output, which is you're engaging your muscles, swinging your leg back, looking and kicking, and then all the neurons in between that form that circuit. Extremely simplified because there's a lot going on in that example. But what's cool is that circuits can really vary in size and function. So for example, you can have a circuit that is restricted to one part of the brain. So I can have a circuit that is only in my frontal lobe. It activates in my frontal lobe, and then the output happens in my frontal lobe. You can also have circuits that branch into different parts of the brain. So it could start in your frontal lobe, and then it could end somewhere, let's say in your motor cortex or your visual cortex, and we'll get into a little bit of the different cortexes soon. And then what's really interesting is you can actually have circuits that kind of interconnect with other circuits. And this forms into large, what we call neural networks. And there's going to be a whole portion of this episode that is focusing solely on neural networks. How circuits are formed, there's many ways, but primarily it's through activity. So as I mentioned before, a neuron, when it's firing, it emits an electrical impulse. So the activity, yes, it's chemicals, right? So it is neurotransmitters binding to receptors, but this will change the electrical signal of that neuron. The brain is extremely energy efficient. It requires a lot of energy. It requires 20% of our entire body's energy, and considering that it's only a couple pounds, it's pretty remarkable. So any way that it can be efficient, it will try. And so if you're stimulating a circuit, what it will do is if you receive high frequency stimulation, it'll begin to create processes so that it can fire easier. What's very cool about neurons is it's an all or nothing signal. So the neuron doesn't have like a stronger signal or a weaker signal. It is either going to fire or it's not going to fire. This is why you need high frequency stimulation to have a very efficient circuit. So that just means that you're doing that function over and over and over and over and over again. High frequency stimulation. There's many different ways the circuit can become more efficient. Some examples would be that there'll be increased dendrite branching, increase in synapses, increase or decrease in receptors, so those proteins that bind to neurotransmitters. And what this will do is that circuit won't need the same high frequency stimulation in order to fire. And a great example of this is when we ride our bike. So when we're younger, we learn how to ride our bike. It takes us several days, weeks, months for some of us, a lot of falling, training wheels, scraped knees, and then eventually you become comfortable and you can ride your bike, no problem. Then, you become a teenager or an adult, and for whatever reason, you spend years not riding your bike. And then all of a sudden you're 30 and your friend says, oh, let's go for a bike ride. And you can get on a bike, no problem. You don't have to start all the way from scratch like when you were 5 with your training wheels, helmet, scraping your knees. And it's for this reason, because you have that high frequency stimulation, you have wired that circuit so that it's efficient and you don't need that same stimulation in order for it to fire. And this This concept of making circuits more efficient, having more synapses, more branching, less branching, this is what we call neuroplasticity. So when we're rewiring circuits or changing circuits, it plays on this concept of neuroplasticity. Something else I want to say here, the saying that I have a whole episode for, and I'll link it down below, cells that fire together, wire together, also is linked to this concept. It was a theory presented by a neuropsychologist that was studying at McGill, Donald Hebb. And the famous rhyme was coined by an electrophysiologist, neuroscientist, researcher, Dr. Carla Schatz. One thing that neuroplasticity is not, that I think people get confused by, understandably so, is it's not the birth of new neurons. So the brain can create new neurons, and we do have what we call neural stem cells, which are just kind of, for lack of a better word, baby cells or cells that have the ability to change into other different cell types, kind of like a reservoir in the brain. But for the most part, neurons don't what we call regenerate. They don't birth new neurons, which is why neurodegenerative diseases, right, like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's, are so detrimental because the brain really struggles to produce new cells. That is called neurogeneration. Neuroplasticity is different. It plays on the connections. And you might be thinking, well, why does changing the connections matter if I can't, make new cells or get new cells? How impactful could changing connections be? Well, you may be surprised, but one neuron, like for example, we have neurons in our cerebellum. We'll get into the different parts of the brain in a second, being discovered for a lot of other things, but primarily for motor and posture. One of those cells that are beautiful Purkinje cells, I'm gonna throw up a picture here, can have 100,000 synaptic connections. Your brain has trillions with an S connections. So if you can play and change on those connections, your possibilities are absolutely endless. So now that we've kind of covered the basic unit of a circuit, right, a neuron, how they're connected, what a circuit, how it's wired, what function does it have, let's go into the different parts of the brain. And then we'll get into neural networks. So when circuits come in with circuits, and I have a cool couple neural circuits I want to share with you today because they've changed my life and how I view my brain. We have 4 lobes of our brain. Now our brain, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with this, is incredibly wrinkly. And these are the wrinkles we love. We love a good wrinkle. The wrinkly brain is great. And it's like this for a few reasons. One is to increase surface area. And what this does is it increases the amount of connections that we can have, which again, we've just established why that's so important and how powerful it is to tap into. It also has deeper grooves that help separate the brain into functions. So the 4 major lobes, and I have 2 extra for fun, are the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. So as it suggests, frontal's in the front. This is where our executive functions are, decision-making, cognition. This is the last lobe to fully develop. So if you ever heard of, your brain is not fully developed until you're 25, basically when we're younger, we have a lot of connections available. And through life experience and activity and a combination of genetics, we prune our synapses, which just means that we kind of get rid of the unnecessary connections. This happens all throughout the brain, but this happens kind of last for the frontal, age 25, although there is some debate about that, but I'm going to share it with you anyway. Then right behind it is the parietal lobe. And lots of really great stuff happens here. This is where our somatosensory information is. And all that is the body's, the brain's blueprint of the body for different sensory information like touch, temperature, also our motor movements, deciding our motor movements, executing our motor movements, they happen in the parietal lobe as well. At the very back is our occipital lobe, which is responsible for processing our vision, which I always find kind of fun because it's literally like the furthest point away from your eyes. And then underneath all of that, so yeah, underneath all of that, we have our temporal. And we'll get into that in the neural network because there's some really cool structures there. But that's where we have some of our auditory processing. It's also where our memories are, emotions, all that cool stuff. Then we have the cerebellum, which is kind of underneath our occipital lobe in the back. Some people call this kind of like a mini brain, and if you have ever seen it, and you'll see it here if you're watching the video, you can see why. It kind of has its own separate grooves, and this is where some of our motor movements are. In particular, posture is really important in this area. But there's lots of cool work being done looking at how it impacts motivation, decision making. So not to like, you know, cerebellum deserves a lot of attention. It's not going to get it in this foundation episode, but just so you know. And I'll put some cool resources at the bottom if you're curious and want to go down that realm. And then at the very base of your brain, really hidden by all these other structures, is what we call our hindbrain, our lizard brain, our brainstem. And these are functions that are absolutely 10 out of 10 critical for our survival. So our breathing rate, our sleep, appetite. And so there's a reason why they're at the base and they're protected by all of these structures. And so if you've ever heard somebody say lizard brain, that is most likely what they mean. And so neural networks are different regions of the brain that'll be active at the same time to execute a specific function. And there are 7 well-studied ones, but I'm going to share with you 3 or 4 that I find particularly interesting. And this is going to be important when we get into more of the rewiring, because you can kind of turn these networks on with certain tools and modalities. You can also turn them off. So I'll give you a brief introduction to 4 of my favorites. I'm gonna add a link to all these networks so you can dig into them more, but I will give a brief introduction to them here. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the default mode network. Some of the regions involved in this network, although it's kind of continually changing as we study it more, is the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, which is a nuclei in the front of our brain, and then a few structures in our temporal lobe. So one of them is the posterior cingulate cortex, and there's also some other areas in our temporal lobe that are more lateral, more to the side, the lateral temporal lobe. And this has been studied linking to ruminating thoughts, mind wandering, daydreaming, self-referential thoughts, so the idea of thinking of yourself. And this one has been studied in a few different contexts. One in attention deficit, so the idea that if you're not focusing, right, that you may get into this default mode network. Also for depression, in particular thinking of kind of thought rumination and negative storytelling plays a bit with the default mode network activity. The next one I want to share is our limbic system. And this one you've probably heard of before. Most of these structures are found in our temporal lobe, although you will find some in the frontal areas as well. So some of the key structures in this area would be things like your hippocampus, where a lot of your learning and memory occurs, amygdala, which is a lot of fear processing. And so this area really, or this network I should say, helps quite a bit with emotional regulation, memory processing, retrieving, encoding. You know, a lot of people will look into this in terms of stress response, PTSD, right? Like repressed memories, retrieving memories. Limbic system is where a lot of people will focus on. The third one I want to share is the central executive network, also sometimes referred to as the frontal-parietal network. And in the name, you can tell that it has some regions in the frontal cortex as well as a region in the parietal. And its main job is focus. And even beyond focus, it's really related to, using your working memory, right? Which I'm sure you guys have heard a lot about, which is just the memory that helps you manipulate information. So problem solving, being able to control kind of what comes in, what comes out. This is the network that is responsible for those kinds of functions. And the last one, which I find super cool, is the salience network. Has some similar regions to the central executive network, but what makes this different, this is all about redirecting your attention. So salience, if you don't know, is basically when you find something salient, when it's noteworthy, when it's grabbing your attention, it's something different, you notice it. And so one of the key areas that are different with the saliency network is the anterior cingulate cortex. Notice how it's a little different than the posterior cingulate cortex, which we found in the default mode network. Same structure, just the front of it, not the back of it. So that is involved in the saliency network, which is the network that helps us redirect our focus. And so the last thing I want to cover that really brings all of this together is brain wave activity. So as we chatted about before in the beginning, neurons will send electrical impulses to communicate with other neurons. Now, when neurons are communicating and different brain structures are communicating with each other, and when you have this network activity, which is groups of brain structures that are active at the same time, what can happen is that these electrical impulses sync up and create a bigger signal. And this signal is what we call a brain wave. So just like a wave of the ocean or like a frequency of light, this electrical impulse will create a curve. And this curve will happen at different frequencies. And so the way that brainwave frequencies are measured are in hertz. And so all that is kind of like how many cycles can happen, a cycle being one wave in a second. And we have different ranges of these hertz, and we've given them different titles. And basically when your brain are in these different frequencies, they are usually in a specific state. And so I'll walk you through what those are now. And this is going to be super cool and a great place to go back to when you're consuming stuff on social media about different brain waves and how to influence them and what tools to use. This will be a great place to refresh yourself. So we have high frequency brain waves and low frequency brain waves. So we're going to start all the way from the bottom, which is our delta brainwave. So our delta brainwave is kind of in between 1 to 4 hertz. It is our slowest brainwave, and it's associated most often with deep sleep. Once you go one higher, we're in between the 4 to 8 hertz range, and this is called theta. And our theta is usually associated with a flow state as we kind of come out of a sleep, especially a deep sleep where we have our delta. We'll get into this theta wave. And so this can be associated with light sleep or meditation practices or kind of tapping into your unconscious mind, or your subconscious mind, I should say, not unconscious. You're not tapping into much when you're unconscious. This is our theta wave. Lots of cool studies on this. I will pause it for a different episode because this is foundations and I can't get off track. One more up is our alpha, and this is going to be our 8 to 12 hertz brainwave. And so this is associated with relaxation as well as alertness. You often see these in beats on Spotify, like playlists that play with your alpha brainwave, and we'll get into what that actually is in a second. So it's associated with relaxation, and it'll often get paired with kind of stress reduction playlist. Then we get to a higher stimulation, which is called our beta. And this has a wider range. So this one is actually can be broken up into several kind of subtypes in between kind of like 13 to 30 hertz, typically associated with concentration, focus, and learning. And this makes a lot of sense when we think of high frequency stimulations, right? And that high frequency stimulations over and over and over again can create new circuits. So when we're thinking of learning something new, beta is the brain wave that is typically associated with that. And the last one that is starting to get a lot more attention in the research space, especially when it comes to meditation, but again, I'm going to tone down the geeky for this one and save it for later, is gamma. And so gamma is like high frequency stimulation, kind of 30 hertz up. Some people say it can get up to 200 hertz, but it's hard to know how that's measured, right? Because we can only measure as much as the tools can allow us to measure. And this is associated with like a higher level of consciousness, heightened perception, often associated with being really expert at something. And so I'm going to leave it there because there's a lot of cool stuff when it comes to gamma, and I might do just a whole episode on like just scouring the research space to see what we kind of know about gamma right now. It's a cool time to be gamma in the neuroscience world. When we're often in the media, when we're hearing about brain waves, we're often hearing about ways and modalities and tools for brain entrainment. And this is a topic in which you can use external stimuli, so external being not your own brain, to basically sync up your brain waves or to begin to shift yourself to a different state. So a good example, which there has been some research on, and it's continuing to build, so I wouldn't, put all your money in what I'm saying right now. A good example of brain entrainment would be binaural beats. So binaural beats, what they are is if you have your headphones in, you have one ear with a specific tone at a specific frequency, and then another ear, it will be different. And the difference between these two tones will be the hertz that you desire, so that frequency. So for example, if I wanted to be in a more relaxed state, maybe I want to have more alpha brain activity, I could listen to a binaural beats where that difference would be between 8 to 12 hertz. And then I'm entraining my brain to sync up to that frequency. So if you're here, well done. Really, really, really great work. This stuff is not easy. And it's not easy for a reason. Our brain is complicated, but you don't need to have a PhD in neuroscience to be able to get a good understanding of brain fundamentals. And I think it's important for everyone because there are so many things to choose from when it comes to our brain health. And I think it's hard to make an informed decision when you don't have a good understanding of the basics. So I invite you to listen to this more than once. Again, high frequency stimulation creates new circuits. And I've timestamped everything. So please come back to specific sections as you get exposed to new information, just so that you can make an informed decision because, there's a lot to choose from. It can be quite overwhelming, and your time and brain energy is extremely valuable. So, I'm here to support you to choose wisely. Not everything is going to work for everyone. We're all unique creatures. So again, listen to this over and over again. I am going to expand again on one of the topics that I posted in my poll, right? So either meditation in the brain, breath work in the brain, or neurofeedback. I haven't decided quite yet. So if there is something particular that you are interested in, curious about, please leave it in the comments below. I'm happy to do a deep dive now that we all have the fundamentals under wraps. And thank you so much for all of your juicy brain energy, and I look forward to geeking out with you soon. Take care.